Okay, should we give it a couple more minutes?
People are coming into the room. Welcome, everyone. You can see the attendees here in our participant list. There is Heather Meany from JCC. Welcome, Jennifer Kitchen. Welcome to everyone I don't know.
Oh.
Welcome to Robin Warner. Very good. We have a nice group coming in here.
Okay, Stair, should we get going then?
Yeah, I think we should get going. Let's go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stair. Well, welcome to our Constitution Day virtual panel, Getting Money Out of Politics Creates a More Perfect Union, which is being co-sponsored by American Promise, Network Nova, Clean Money Squad, Williamsburg, JCC Invisible, Clean Virginia, Voters' Right to Know, Activate Virginia, and Uncoke My Campus. In particular, we want to express our thanks to Stair Calhoun for offering to host this event as a part of the Network Nova. I'm Michael Deal, volunteer with the Virginia chapter of American Promise, and I'll serve as moderator tonight. Before I introduce our panel, I just have a couple of housekeeping items to go over. For our audience, please say hello in the chat box and tell us where you're from. We encourage your questions, so please use the Q&A box to submit your question. Time may not permit us to include every question this evening, but don't worry, we'll get back to you with answers as soon as we can. So joining our panel tonight, we're very privileged to have Hedrick Smith, a New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author of The Russians and Who Stole the American Dream. Also John Pudner, Executive Director of Take Back Our Republic, known as takeback.org, who has been involved in political campaigns for 3 decades, having worked as a Romney 2008 advisor and a Bush 2000 aide. Here in Virginia, John helped jumpstart David Bratt's primary campaign win over U.S. Majority Leader Eric Cantor in 2014. Also this evening, Senator Creed Deeds, who represents Virginia's 25th Senate District, is joining us. He serves on 5 Senate standing committees and chairs the Privileges and Elections Committee. After serving 10 years in the House, Senator Deeds was elected to the Senate in 2001. Delegate Schuyler Van Valkenburg is also joining us. He was elected in 2017 to represent Virginia's 72nd District in Henrico County. Schuyler is also a high school teacher, and notably for tonight's discussion, he is the We the People Constitutional Competition Coach at Glen Allen High School. And last but not least, Nancy Morgan, who's coordinator for the Virginia chapter of American Promise. Nancy is a retired economist who worked overseas for the United Nations for 20 years. Her last post was Tunisia, and she returned to the US committed to working on good governance. Our panel will explore how we as Virginians can take action guided by history and the stories of average citizens across the country who have successfully mobilized against the corrosive impact of money on our elections. As context for tonight's discussion, a day which celebrates our nation's Constitution, we want to underscore the role of grassroots activism in amending the US Constitution to incorporate changes that have expanded the rights of democracy and advanced the ultimate promise of our nation, equal representation for all. People power over the past 2.5 centuries has led to overturning Supreme Court decisions through amending the Constitution 6 times. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments corrected the notorious Dred Scott decision that tried to lock in slavery and oppression as constitutional law. The 17th Amendment created the popular election of US senators. The 19th granted women the right to vote. The 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax. And in 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. It's notable that Virginia this year became the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. paving the way for another amendment, the 28th. Unlike the long, torturous process that women, racial minorities, and the gay and lesbian community endured in winning their rights, corporations successfully waged campaigns to establish their rights and win greater freedom from business regulations in the courts of law, much sooner, more easily, and not based on national consensus. This hour-long virtual panel tonight will examine citizen activism across the country and here in Virginia to overturn a series of Supreme Court decisions that have eroded our ability to regulate election spending so as to control corruption and incentivize politicians to seek broad citizen support. As a result of the 2010 Supreme Court's ruling, Citizens United, now wealthy donors and special interests are free to spend without limits through super PACs and dark money groups. This discussion, while exploring options to get big money out of politics, will cover both the constitutional amendment process at the federal level and legislative action at the state level here in Virginia. Leading us off tonight, Hedrick Smith, who's going to be showing a short outtake on his Washington State portion of his video, The Democracy Rebellion, will be leading us off. Hedrick, please explain why you embarked on a mission to document citizen activism that culminated in your film, The Democracy Rebellion.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks to Nancy for organizing this. Welcome to all the folks who are joining us from around the state of Virginia. This is an important day. This is an important event. It's important because we're talking about power, the power of we the people. I remember taking a trip to Texas some years ago, and a guy in Texas said something to me about power in America that I will never forget. A guy named Ernie Cortez, who's a Latino organizer in the Southwest, in Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. He said, you know, Rick, they say power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He said, but powerlessness also corrupts. If we feel we are powerless, it corrupts democracy at the core. In other words, if we, the people, don't exercise our power, don't assert ourselves when we see big money, outside money, foreign money, or we see people tilting elections, we see corruption of our system. If we don't take action, we are disempowering ourselves. And actually the great news from my reporting around the country, to my surprise, I will have to admit, is that the last 10 years or so, since the famous Supreme Court Citizens United decision in January 2020, has actually been a period of great activism. And John Putner is now doing what he's doing at Take Back Our Republic. During that period, he moved out of the campaign business into the campaign reform business, which is terrific. And there are a lot of other people who've done it. People don't know it, but 2018, the last election year, was the greatest year for political reform in America since the Civil Rights Movement. And I happen to have covered the Civil Rights Movement. That's how long I've been doing this journalism business, back in the 1960s. There were 5 states that adopted gerrymander reform: Michigan and Ohio and Missouri and Utah, you know, were out there doing that. There were 7 states that pushed on voters' rights. There were 4 big cities, Baltimore, Phoenix, Denver, Portland, Oregon, that adopted public funding of campaigns. Up in North Dakota, they passed a reform measure. A bunch of people who called themselves the badass grandmas of North Dakota, a bunch of women in their 70s mobilized a campaign, and Putner was involved up there helping them as well. I mean, it's an amazing thing. It's spreading all over the country. And I think it is actually the Citizens United decision which cut loose the floodgates, as one of the dissenting justices said, Justice Stevens. It cut loose the floodgates of money, and it really upset people all over the country. And you began to see people responding and states responding. In some instances, the leadership of the legislature wrote Congress and said, you've got to have an amendment. We've got to roll back this. We've got to restore the power of Congress and the states to regulate campaign money in political campaigns. And some of them did it through legislative action, and some of them did it through referendums. And what I want to show you is an example of people power in Washington state, where average people came off the sidelines. They came off their couches and volunteered and actually managed to get a statewide vote to roll back Citizens United. Nancy, I hope you can share this part of the video with folks, because I think they'll be surprised. Just ordinary people like you and me, not pros.
Today, the states are where the action is on reform. So it's time for me to get out into the country to take the measure of the new wave of grassroots rebellions. First stop, Seattle. A band of volunteers have come to galvanize support for a statewide vote on an initiative to curb billionaire and corporate money in political campaigns, hoping to pressure Congress to take action.
Primarily, we're targeting voters that don't know about our initiative, because you know the recent polling showed 36% are undecided.
It's Initiative 735.
Hey, thank you.
We need to put the power of the vote back into the hands of the people so that the wealthy entities will no longer have a pipeline.
Linda Bach is a modern Paul Revere, awakening the popular rebellion. She collected 21,000 signatures to help put Initiative I-735 on the 2016 ballot.
I've long had the idea that I am continuing the American Revolution. Every signature I get is just another check for the Constitution and the power of we the people. Democracy, you must fight for it or it'll slip right out of your hands.
Fear that mega money is corrupting our democracy has turned average Americans like Cindy Black into reformers.
I definitely think the Supreme Court decision of Citizens United has unleashed so much money in our system that it's ceased being a democracy, and now we've turned into an oligarchy.
In Washington state, volunteer activist Cindy Black leads the charge for ballot initiative 735.
And just by a show of hands, how many of you collected signatures for 735 out there? Give everybody a round of applause, those folks, because we collected 293,000 of our signatures were collected by volunteers. So I have never run a campaign before. I'm really a grassroots organizer. I was in the Air Force. I was a crew chief, and then I went to college. I was a marriage and family therapist for quite a few years, and then running my own business.
Black is the spark plug of a statewide citizen movement.
Your country back.
We're trying to get our citizens, our voters on record saying that we do not believe that corporations are people. We do not believe that money is speech, and that we think that political contribution should be regulated and made public.
Let's give a round of applause for Spokane!
Black has a statewide network of volunteers from the Idaho border to the Pacific coast.
It's not about left or right. I don't care if you're a Democrat, Republican, or other. We just want government that represents you, not the big briefcase full of money.
But how can amateurs win without big funding? I've talked to professional politicians in this state. They say it takes $3 million to run a successful political campaign in Washington state. You don't have $3 million.
No.
So what does it take to win? You're in a big state here, Washington state.
We talk to people. That's how we're doing it. Contact, direct voter contact, person to person.
Please tell your friends and family.
Okay. You can pass an initiative with a grassroots effort with a small budget. We can do it.
And they did it. 63% of Washington state voters rejected Citizens United and unlimited corporate money in campaigns. It takes 34 states to force Congress to act on a constitutional amendment. 20 states are now on record against Citizens United. Getting 14 more is the next challenge.
Edric, that was a great video. Thanks for sharing that with us tonight. And I encourage our audience to take a look at the Democracy Rebellion. Watch the entire video. It's really quite impressive. But Edric, Washington state is a ballot initiative state. Here in Virginia, we don't have that. We'd have to go through the legislature. What's your lessons learned from looking around the states? What advice do you have here for Virginia?
Well, there are other states that are like Virginia. Connecticut, for example, is a state where you have to pass a reform like gerrymander reform or like Citizens United reform through the legislature. Up in Connecticut, the reform they adopted was public funding of campaigns, and it's absolutely revolutionary what it's done. But it was a popular movement that put the pressure on the politicians in the legislature. There were a couple of cases of corruption. There were issues that came up, and I'm sure there are issues about money in politics in Virginia that are controversial, the money coming in from outside the state. So there's something that you could feed on that people are sensitive to, but it was the public pressure in Connecticut, hundreds and hundreds of phone calls. They did car washes for clean government. They raised money that way. And they put pressure on the politicians, a Republican governor and a democratically dominated state legislature, and put the heat on them to the point where the legislature and the politicians felt they had to go along with public opinion. So being organized at the grassroots, exercising and mobilizing people power has tremendous impact. And sometimes they're reluctant politicians, and they went into districts, state Senate districts or state legislative districts, House districts, where there were reluctant legislators who didn't want to go along with reform. And they had public meetings, they had rallies, they had phone banks, and they put the heat on the politicians. This is an exercise of democracy. I mean, what that woman, Linda Bach, said is really worth remembering. I feel like I'm a Paul Revere. I'm in the tradition of the American Revolution. Democracy, if you don't fight for it, it slips right through your hands. I mean, that's it. It's been slipping through our hands. And what's encouraged me is to see whether you're talking North Dakota, I just mentioned that, anti-corruption, Washington State, Citizens United, 5 states I gave you on gerrymandering, Connecticut, public funding of campaigns, Florida's done a bunch of stuff, North Carolina's done, it's all around. The ferment is growing here. People are unhappy with the state of American democracy and realizing the politicians are not gonna fix it unless we give them some, well, let's put it nicely, some strong encouragement.
Well, thank you, Hedrick. That's a great way to lead off our panel discussion tonight. You've given us some inspiration. And it's a good segue for Nancy Morgan. Nancy, thank you for organizing tonight's event. You've put in a lot of effort. Here in Virginia, could you help us set the stage for a discussion of campaign finance reform in the state, including a resolution calling for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, and introduce the audience to the role being played by American Promise's Virginia chapter? Nancy, did we lose you?
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. And it's always inspirational to follow Hedrick. Just a note for Stair, Delegate Van Belkerberg is trying to join us. He's in the waiting room. And so you may want to, I gave him my code, so you may want to look at that. Anyway, let's just take a look at Virginia. What is American Promise? And actually, in the context of our constitutional amendment, which was ratified in 1788, their ideas, the founding fathers, was obviously that it was a representative democracy. So when moving forward to 2020, what is American Promise? Well, American Promise is an organization in the democracy reform space, along with John Putner and Take Back Our Republic, who are looking at their cross-partisan nonprofit to empower a citizens advocacy in all 50 states to pass a constitutional amendment. Constitutional amendment, obviously, as Hedrick says, it's to overturn Citizens United and to allow Congress and the states to regulate campaign spending. And within a broader context, we've set up a big money out group looking at Virginia, because Virginia, as we'll point out, is the one of 5 states that has no, it has no limitations on campaign finance. So we're looking at that. So in order to do this, mention was made of the role of in the Supreme Court and citizens advocacy in terms of creating, mobilizing civic action to have constitutional amendment. And I think it's worthwhile rolling back the clock. So here we are in Virginia, but it's 1971 and we are in Richmond. And who are we looking at? We're looking at future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell. And he asserted in his Powell memo, he was discussing with the head of the Chamber of Commerce, who was also a Virginian, that the American economic system is under broad attack. The key message is business must acquire political power. And interestingly enough, he was nominated to the Supreme Court by President Nixon 2 months later. Maybe our whole history would have been changed if there hadn't been that nomination. But just taking a look at some of the Supreme Courts that have made cases that have made a difference, there was Buckley versus Vallejo. That was the first mention of money equals speech. The whole idea of corporations as people goes back to the 1800s, but this was the first ruling that actually opened up the idea of saying you can't put limits on spending, election spending. And interestingly enough, and I didn't know this until recently, it's under Buckley versus Vallejo that people like Bloomberg can actually use his funds to finance his elections. And then there's Citizens United that Hedrick and Mike referred to, that basically tossed out restrictions on corporate spending. There's McCutcheon versus FEC, there's Speech Now. The one thing that's very interesting, and I found out that since Chief Justice Roberts came in 2005 and Alito came in 2006, there have been 6 decisions that have significantly reshaped the legal landscape, dictating how much money can flow into political races. So you can see that there's been the Supreme Court has had a considerable role in this area. And the legislative impact, well, you had all these states that had legislation on campaign finance. 24 of them had to roll back their legislation. I think the most notable one that we all know from watching the documentary Dark Money was the Montana case, where they had 100 years of campaign finance rules to protect their natural environments, and all of those sort of went out the window. For those people who are money in politics trivia, it's quite interesting. Here we are back in Virginia. Citizens United is a Virginia company. So let's see what that meant in terms of money in politics. And this is Open Secrets, a great source of money, both campaign financing and independent spending, dark money, as well as super PACs, where super PACs have to disclose. But you can see that the escalation in the spending, and it sort of culminated in 2018, where $5.6 billion was spent on just our congressional races. And interestingly enough, for Virginia trivia, is the 10th district, which Barbara Comstock and Jennifer Wexton, that was the 9th most expensive race in the country. So when you're looking at what's happening in 2020, it's already over $4.5 billion. That probably will go up to, if anybody wants to make a bet, I'll put up $10. I bet it will be over $7 billion. And this comes in through the direct spending and also through the super PAC money and trying to figure out what dark money is. So if anybody wants to put money on it, I've got $10. And so the impacts, candidate with the most money usually wins. Incumbents have a advantage. Only 10% of our House races are competitive because of the incumbency issue and also the gerrymandering issue. 2/3 of political donations come from 0.2% of the population. Our legislators can tell you 30 to 70% of time spent on funding. I'm sure that our legislators who are joining us from Virginia can talk about that. And most importantly for us as citizens, public policies don't reflect the wish of the voters. And whether you're looking at climate change, whatever issue, you're looking at incarceration, payday lending, there's always money that is linked to that. So the citizens are not getting the voice that they need in terms of policies. Well, Virginia, Virginia, it's interesting. Look at the swing state, and you know, even the trend line is even accelerated from the federal side. In 2019, which was the House of Delegates and the Senate, it was $122 million. $25 million came from outside the state. The source is We have a Good Source Virginia Public Access Project. So it was really incredible when you look at the last race in Virginia, and I'll just say, I won't mention his name, but in the 40th district, there was a race and it cost $3.8 million for that race. This has nothing to do with the candidates, it's the system, but just compare that. These guys are paid $19,000 a year. So you're spending $3.8 million to get a position that pays you $20,000 a year. There's something wrong there. And so Virginia is one of 5 states I mentioned that has no limitations on campaign finance contributions. There were a lot of bills introduced in the last session. Of course, it was a busy session, a lot of bills. Senator Deeds can attest to that, Delegate Vanderbilt. And also I was watching the discussion on, there were 2 bills in the Senate Privileges and Elections Committee. Quite interesting discussion. It's a challenge to get change in Virginia. They died in committee and nothing got on the floor, and we couldn't get anyone to support a resolution for a constitutional amendment. That was perhaps just because it was such a busy session, but we're very optimistic about this year. So as Hedrick said, there's this huge momentum. He mentioned the 20 states. We want Virginia to be the 21st. Alaska might be the 21st because it's it's a referendum on their ballot in November. But the incredible thing is that, you know, on a local level, over 900 cities and towns have passed resolution. Here in Virginia, there have been 4. And if you watch the Wisconsin race when they were all out voting during COVID, there were actually 17 cities and towns that passed resolutions to overturn Citizens United because they have local ballot initiatives. It's amazing. There's a lot of grassroots enthusiasm out there. In terms of the Congress, there's a bill in the House and there's a bill and a companion bill in the Senate. We need 67 senators. We have 47. Unfortunately, they're all Democrat. 290 representatives. This isn't correct. We've got 221. So there is opportunities, but it shouldn't be a Democrat-led initiative. This is a bipartisan issue. We need to get Republicans, and now with all this money coming in from the left, there should be an ability to craft a bipartisan solution to this issue. So what are we doing in Virginia? We're building up awareness about the corrosive impact of money, getting Virginia to be the 21st, and we had a very good discussion with Senator Deeds about this. We're hoping that he will be one of our champions. Get our representatives in Congress to support resolutions, and we have 11 legislators. 7 of the Democrats signed and 4 Republicans didn't. But we just, as I said, this isn't a partisan issue. We just have to build awareness and support, as Senator Deeds said, grease the squeaky wheel. And we're pushing for campaign finance. So we really hope you join us. On the pictures of the side, you can see us with Marcus Simon. He had a bill on public financing of election. He's a champion of this. We're in Congress. I was talking with my Senator Adam Eben, and we do outreach. So Mike, thank you very much. And let's go on with the discussion.
Great, thank you, Nancy. You really did help set the stage for us. I'd like to get Senator Deeds involved in the discussion, and I'd particularly like to get his view on whether we can get a resolution passed here in Virginia. But first, let me give Senator Deeds a chance to give us his perspective on why money in politics is a problem.
Well, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me. And Nancy, I really appreciate your history lesson. I'm glad you talked about the Buckley case. A lot of people get so hung up on the Citizens United case, they forget that the Buckley case is really the root of the problem. We need a constitutional amendment that says that in my view, as long as you have limits on contributions without limits on spending, you are going to benefit the wealthy candidate. And there's no way of getting around that. You're benefiting the wealthy candidate. You need a constitutional amendment that says that campaign spending is not free speech. Is not speech, because that way you get around the Buckley and you get around the Citizens United case, and that way states, and if you give states the ability to regulate spending, you can impose limits on the amount of money you spend You can impose limits on the amount of advertising that occurs. You can impose limits on the amount of time that you can't have to campaign. We could have more of a British style of campaigns. And in my view, this artificial economy we've created around campaigns that some of us have benefited from would no longer exist. And maybe we could get back to making things in this country, not just making politicians and making campaigns.
Well, Senator, thank you for that. What do you think it'll take to get a resolution passed here in Virginia?
Well, I just don't know. You know, there are so many incumbents that like what they do enough. They like their jobs, and they don't like the idea that anybody threatens their job. They're always concerned that they're going to come up against a guy who is a gazillionaire, who has the ability to finance his own campaign, and they don't want to do anything to inhibit their ability to raise the money that they feel like they need to stay and keep their job. So campaign finance reform has always, and I've been on these bills, I've been voting for these bills since the 90s. Campaign finance reform always has a hard time in Virginia. But in my view, if you look at it from the writ large, from the big perspective, a national movement to change the United States Constitution, to put limits on spending, to recognize that spending is not free speech. I think then you will maybe you can enter the heads of the senators and delegates from a different perspective. And it seems to me you've got a fair shot. Now, will it happen this time? This is a short session. We are in extraordinary times. You know, you can ask Delegate Van Valkenburg. We're doing things every week now that a part-time legislature shouldn't have to be doing. And I have no idea what this coming session is going to look like. I don't know how much of it's going to be virtual. I don't know how approachable the various legislators are going to be. But this is an idea whose time has come. It came a long time ago. It's just a matter of getting to the people that are going to have to cast the votes.
Well, Senator, just a follow-up question. We're going to get more into the legislative agenda for campaign finance in Virginia a little later in the discussion. But just to be clear, you're saying that the constitutional amendment at the federal level is really the most important thing and has to happen first?
Absolutely, it has to happen. It has to happen first. I think limits, I voted to impose federal style limits in Virginia, but the reality is that imposes a burden on the less wealthy candidate, the ordinary guy who's running for office, who has to support a family, who has limits, who has a millionaire or a billionaire running against him, is at a disadvantage. And while there are wealthy people in the legislature, the vast majority of people in the legislature aren't wealthy. And they don't want to give their opponents an advantage. And so, in my view, limits, that discussion can be had, but you're always going to have problems with that. I think the federal constitutional amendment needs to happen first.
Great. Thank you. I see John wanting to jump in here, and I want to turn to him. And I'm sure he wants to respond to your comments. But John, we'd also be interested in you sharing your experience with campaigns here in Virginia, particularly the Brett Cantor primary campaign in 2014. How did that campaign influence your views on money in politics?
Well, it was the difference in that campaign from my first campaigns, which actually even predate state delegate credees. My first ones were before he was even a delegate by a couple of years to date myself. But, I'm honored to be on with you, Senator Deeds. I was, a Richmonder growing up. We grew up below the poverty line 51 weeks a year. And then 1 week a year, we went out to beautiful Bath County in your neck of the woods to Douthit State Park. So that was the 1 week of joy and freedom we had. We lived like we were rich people in a cabin. But so share that experience. But when I came in to do campaigns in '88, it really was the Democrats who'd kind of gotten fat on the system. And we were being outspent, say, $200,000 to $25,000 in a race. And I've said my whole life, I'm so glad I went through that, because we learned to do door-to-door right. We learned to work fairs. We had no money. I still remember my first boss telling me our goal is to get up to 1/3 of the legislature, in either chamber, so we can stop a veto if we ever elect a Republican. That was as high as our goal was set as Republicans. Now, people used to really laugh at that when my employer, Bill Howell, was Speaker. Now I don't know, maybe it's heading back to 1/3, but for a while there was, flipped the other way. But we learned to do things so inexpensively. We learned to do them so well in grassroots. And by 97, I did a petition drive for a guy named Coleman Andrews, who was running for lieutenant governor. He ended up dropping out. But we did that without spending a single dollar, and we would not turn them in until we had signatures in every county in Virginia without a single dollar paid. And I marched them in just to show you the kind of grassroots we developed because we had no money for so many years. And I still remember Charles City County was the last one. I didn't have any signatures, not really a Republican hotbed for those of you not from the state. And I drove there to a gas station and got 8 signatures. And one of the people there discovered I was a Republican, and they kind of chased me out, but that was it. But the kids now who've gone through campaigns, so I'm getting to all the kids now, some of them have done nothing but these air wars, and they don't even want to be on the campaign. They want to be on the third party that has all the money. And I just say, during my years, and Brat was the last race, going back and doing the Dave Brat race old school, and of course there are all kinds of promises that, you'll never work in Republican politics in Virginia again. Well, luckily winning that meant I didn't have to. I, formed something else. But to go in there with a bunch of contacts, and we had 17,000 grassroots activists just sitting on my computer from that district. And I've done so many Republican conventions there, which used to be a great grassroots event. They've kind of deteriorated now. But the big difference I saw in Brat 2014, just the light bulb, it was post Citizens United. And just to watch, the power play and the intimidation against running if you weren't part of the, endorsed from on high. And watching how the state legislative races didn't really used to be as national, but now they're all funded by outside. So there's a nationalization of every state race, and these other 2 panelists know it. And the biggest difference, I think, in these third parties is I don't have to ask a candidate about what I'm putting in an ad. If I were running Senator Deed's campaign and we wanted to attack the opponent, I would have to do something he didn't think was shrill, was too out there. He'd want to know if it was accurate. These third parties don't care. These races where 80% of the money's the third party group, they don't care. They're leaving the day the election's gone. And so that, to me, is the big difference. And I just don't want people to get discouraged. I mean, the way we won it with Brat, we had 200 people knocking on doors at a time. We really discovered digital before anyone else did. So we caught a little break. Like, people thought we were actually advertising on Fox News and their hardware show, and we were paying a penny to go to their phone. And in 2014, no one had quite caught on to that yet. So they thought we suddenly had a lot of money. We didn't have money for network, But I think the combination, I encourage every grassroots person, is you can win these referenda if you're willing to do digital, the new thing, inexpensive, and still do the old school. Obviously, COVID's in the way this year, but the fairs, the door knocking, too many try to do one or the other and say, oh, the big money beat us. Well, the big money's still going to be tough. It takes time to overcome. But if you can do those 2, it's so inexpensive now if you really have people behind you, as you will on these causes. And you really can win, whether that's a candidate campaign or whether that's a yes-no vote that you're going through. So there really is some hope. They're new tools. And just be willing to do both the old school and the new school, which is what we found with Brat, and you can win. You can overcome money if you do that part right.
Well, thanks, John. That's fascinating. I guess we'd all very much like to get your opinion, too, on the constitutional amendment, which has become a very partisan issue. And what do you think has to be done to reach out to Republicans to obtain their support?
Well, that's, we're strongly for a constitutional amendment. Certainly that gets us some blowback, among leaders and all, obviously among just average Republicans. There's plenty of support for ending Citizens United. One nice thing that for where I am is I can point out to them now that the dark money was more on the left than the right for the first time ever in 2018. So at least that gets some of them who were would quietly tell me, yeah, it's a terrible system, but, we're kind of cleaning the Democrats' clock on it, several years ago. Well, that's not true anymore. And how these people thought they were going to long-term outbid Soros and Bloomberg and all the other people they complain about is beyond me. I mean, the money on the right, particularly as Trump has kind of changed the dynamics. I mean, a big percentage of people with big dollars are on the left now. So part of it is just to look, stop making the stupid argument that it's just going to help you. So that's been very helpful. We're starting to see some cracks. It really is like anything, sort of the establishment versus the grassroots fight. While some of your more liberal attendees tonight might view kind of the reactionaries as part of the grassroots, but on these issues they're often better because they really don't like that the chamber took out their primary opponent or things like that. So there really is some groundswell. I was really surprised when I first pitched Ending Citizens United to the Georgia Tea Party when we were first starting this, and I talked about the money moving around and all, and they said, well, even if we all put our money together, the corporation would knock us out in the primary. And I said, well, there's actually this concept on matching dollars if they come from a local district that might fix that. Now, I didn't tell them that was being tried in New York. That would have been the end of the meeting, but they all loved it. I mean, 90% of the room said, boy, if we could match our dollars and, it's actually my district that I'm giving. So they do get it. So, it's just from an on high down. I think at the grassroots, we are building that Republican support some places. We're making progress. Obviously still a fight, but we need to keep making progress.
Thank you, John. Stair, has Delegate Van Valkenburg joined us?
Yes.
I am here.
Okay. All right. I just didn't see your picture, Skylar. I'm sorry. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Of course.
I guess we'd like to get you involved here. And apart from this discussion about the constitutional amendment at the federal level, what kinds of campaign finance reform do you feel are needed here in Virginia?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with the senator that at the core, we do need to change the Constitution. Can everybody hear me? We're good? Okay. At a core, I do think we do need an amendment because I do think we need to solve that Buckley v. Vallejo problem. And so I would go back to the senator's comment that at the end of the day, the goal needs to be kind of changing the paradigm that we're working under, because the paradigm that we're working under right now means we really have to thread a needle to get it right. And, I'm going to say something. I don't think it's, maybe it's controversial based on what we're saying, but I think it's in the spirit of campaign finance reform, which is, I don't think money is actually the problem in politics. I think you can actually make an argument that we don't spend enough money on political engagement and civic engagement and elections. It's who spends it and how it's spent. So when the senator talks about a whole kind of industry that's been created around consultants and advertisements, and when John talks about dark money, and because of Citizens, because of Buckley, and because of the infrastructure that's created, it really distorts the way politics is done. And so a lot of the messaging is done by people who don't care about honesty, to John's point. A lot of money is spent by people who fly into the district, to the senator's point, because they want you to raise as much money as you can in order to spend a media budget that they get a percentage on. And so I think, to kind of John's point where he talked about matching dollars, we need to create a system that ensures that money that does flow into politics doesn't flow into dark money, right? And that's, Virginia's got an awful system, but one thing it at least has is that most of the money is not dark money. I think the last election cycle is kind of representative of that. There were very few races where dark money was dominant. And I actually think mine might have been one of them. But most races, the money flows to the candidate, and that's a good thing, right? So you want to ensure that the money flows to a candidate because then there's accountability. And you want to create a system where the money flows from, ideally, constituents in that area, right? The whole kind of matching dollar concept. And you want to create a system that discourages kind of paper candidates that can campaign based on just these big dollar donations. And you want to try to make it based on candidates who can go out into their community, raise small dollars, get it matched, and do so in a way that has transparency. And so I think to answer your question directly, I do think we need limitations on how much people can give. I think at the federal level, it's actually too low. Because I think what that ends up doing is it says, all right, this person's going to give Abigail Spanberger, or Dave Bratt $2,700, whatever I don't know what the max amount is anymore. And then they're going to take, another 8 and give it to a PAC or a dark money group, right? Whereas if the donations limit's a little higher, they can give to the candidate, but without creating a distorting amount, right? I mean, checks that are like $50,000 for a candidate or $100,000 for a candidate, which kind of distorts the way elections are done, I think. I think that's something we need to look at. I think we need to look at how can we accentuate small dollar donors, because when I go back to, I don't think money's the problem. I think it's who's giving the money that's the problem. Any way within the current system, the current kind of Citizens Buckley system, where we can get candidates to be incentivized to fundraise for small dollar donors within their district, you're also incentivizing door knocking. You're incentivizing going to those community events. You're incentivizing talking about the issues that the people in your district care about. And, you know, there's things like democracy vouchers. There's bills like democracy vouchers. Marcus Simon has carried that in the House. I don't know if that's been in the Senate. There are things like matching dollars. There is, you know, in Virginia, this is probably a big reach, but public financing, where if a candidate can get a certain amount of donors in their district, then that unlocks public financing. I believe Arizona has a law like that. And so these are some just kind of basic ideas, and you know, keeping transparency. And if dark money groups do come in, having strong kind of transparency measures around how they spend money. And so that's just a tease. I mean, that's not comprehensive, but those are some ideas I'll throw out there, and then I'll stop because I want to make sure everybody else can answer and smack me down if they think I'm wrong.
Michael, can I ask a question of the representative? You've talked about a whole lot of different interesting ideas in terms of regulating campaign funding or flows, or who gives the money, or whether the money's dark, or whether it's matched. How can you do any of that as long as you have the Supreme Court decisions and you don't have an amendment to the federal Constitution, because you're into all kinds of free speech issues, and the money has found a way to flow around candidates and parties into PACs and into dark money conduits. So you can't get a hold of that issue. You can't grab the beast without some kind of amendment which says, yeah, you can regulate this.
Well, I mean, I think to that point, I mean, I think that's, I mean, I would half agree and half disagree. I mean, the half agreeing is that, like, we cannot have a sustainable model that actually facilitates small d democracy and gets the money that's necessary into the system without a paradigm change. I fundamentally think that's true. Because at the end of the day, if somebody wants to drop $1 million into a race against me, they can, right? I mean, that's not going to stop. And that did happen last go around, right? And so, I mean, I think there's a fundamental truth there. I do think there are things you can do, right? Like, we know limits are constitutional, so we can put limits on that we hope end the distortion without funneling money the wrong way, right? We know that there are certain systems of public financing we can do that incentivize candidate behavior. You know, it maybe is not perfect.
Those are limits which are voluntarily accepted. The state public funding systems in Maine and Arizona that you referred to, and even more prominently in Connecticut, depend on candidates accepting the idea. The Supreme Court says if you accept it, then you can impose limits, but that's voluntary, it's not legal. So
and you're right. You're right. And I mean, that's where I think you're true, right? Is that at the end of the day, we do need an amendment or a new Supreme Court. I do think that's true. And to that point, there's nothing from stopping rich candidates or rich donors from just bankrolling themselves or their preferred candidate. I mean, that's just true. I mean, that's just fundamentally true in the system we're in. And the thing that keeps me optimistic and doesn't drive me off a ledge is that I think oftentimes when people try to do that artificially, they fail. So I do think that there is still a core democratic legitimacy that holds money in check. Now, it doesn't always work. I'm not a naive, you know, Panglossian optimist here, but like, there is a fundamental truth that when someone tries to artificially push money in for a candidate that does not have buy-in, that they will often fail. And it's also true that money is cyclical. So when John talks about how, you know, right now super PACs are with Democrats, well, I would argue that's just because momentum is with Democrats. And that's a we the people momentum that money follows. That doesn't make it ideal, right? And I think dark, if Joe Biden's elected president, I think you're going to see dark money in 2022 is going to flow to the Republicans. But it doesn't make it ideal. But I do think there is an inherent check there, which doesn't mean we shouldn't be pushing all of our chips to reform the system, to Hedrick's point, because I do believe that at the end of the day, the system as it's created just does create fundamental distortions that are probably unavoidable.
Well, given the shortness of time that we have left, I'd like to turn the conversation a bit to grassroots activism. And in your case, Delegate Van Valkenburg, you've been a major proponent for democracy reforms in Virginia, especially the constitutional amendment on redistricting, which will be on the ballot in November. Are there any lessons in effective grassroots activism that you can draw upon from that experience for this case of overturning Citizens United?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would certainly argue, I would certainly argue that I'm late to that in the sense that I kind of came in at the last stretch in the sense of my advocacy. I do think that grassroots organizing, both at the state level, but also at a national level, because of how kind of extreme gerrymandering was in 2011, just because of the technology changes, if nothing else, I think raised awareness. And I do think it was grassroots organizing that has made any efforts on that reform possible. And I do think that if you look at the redistricting amendment in Virginia, it was a decade of work by a lot of groups. One Virginia 2021 is the group specifically dedicated to it. But I mean, the League of Women Voters, right? The ACLU, there's other groups involved. And so, the politics at the kind of politician level, Senator Deeds talked about incumbents like money, and they do, right? And they like the status quo. I mean, politicians also like gerrymandered districts, right? If I didn't have to work my butt off, do you think I would? And so I think you have the same problems with campaign finance. And I do think you fundamentally have to educate citizens and get them to push. And it does at the end of the day. And I think John is right. Like at the end of the day, it has to be citizens on both parties have to agree to it. The politicians might not, the elites within both parties might not, but if you can at least have that kind of like soft understanding that this is the right thing to do, there's something to work with, right? So, a year ago, it was Republicans who were against redistricting reform and Democrats who were for it. And now we seem to have a little bit of a change around at the elite level. But at the grassroots level, I don't think that's changed, right? I don't think like voters have all of a sudden said, well, now I'm against it because Democrats have a majority. I don't think that's fundamentally the case. I think grassroots supporters and all the groups who have educated voters have led to voters who are like, yeah, I'm going to vote for this. And so I don't care what the politicians think, and I don't care what elite donors think, and I'm going to vote for it. And so I do think that I'm kind of rambling to cut it short. Yes, like, you have to have that grassroots organization, even if it's just creating a soft yes, so that when somebody steps in and puts forward the proposal, there's a certain amount of pressure put on people.
Michael, don't you wonder if John Putnam could tell us how the heck they did it in North Dakota? I mean, you get the badass grandmas, 70-year-old women, and then here's this Republican campaign strategy. She comes in. I mean, talk about just exactly what you were saying, Representative, the people versus the politicians. When you get down to the grassroots level, lots of Republicans and Democrats agree. When they voted on the constitutional amendment in Colorado, it carried every single county in the state, red, blue, purple, you name it, 84%. I mean, it's unbelievable. What happened in North Dakota? I mean, it tells you, citizen power does work when it reaches across party lines.
Well, my favorite line from that was, we won in North Dakota the day that Donald Trump took 62% of the state. So even if every Democrat voted for that bill, we at least got, 16% out of the Republicans. So no, and it's getting in, I mean, it's knowing where to go. I mean, I'm pretty comfortable walking into churches, mega churches with Trump, with Trump pastors who love him, for example. Now North Dakota by mega church, I mean a few thousand people, not quite Charlotte here, but that was my Bush 2000. Its whole faith-based turnout, and I know from the outside both parties view the other party as monolithic and comfortably existing, and any of us in it know no, they we hate each other more in our party than the, than the other party. But to realize, like social conservatives, for example, they don't like the money game. You know, they fight with the libertarians. You know, you just have to, when you're within the party, you kind of figure out which niches are there. And so if it's working churches on a particular battle, or, you know, knowing where to go, and some of this traditional grassroots stuff. But you know, it was just great. It was getting on talk radio. Now, some of the talk radio guys hated me, but I didn't care. I was going for a third of their audience. You know, fine. I was starting with zero. Just get on there and go back and forth. And, you know, they'd at least have to throw in the, well, you did have a history. Now, you were part of 3 Republican takeovers. I went Virginia, then Georgia, then Alabama. All I did was, you know, Republican takeovers and legislatures was always my goal in my partisan days. So, you know, they can't just say, oh, well, you're, you know, you're secretly here. And the response I had in North Dakota to one of these guys is, he said, hey, they're saying it's just out-of-staters trying to switch this around. I said, look, I'm from out of state, but I'm not here seeking one dime from your state the day after this election, win or lose. The people who gave you that line work for some guys in Kansas who have 9 asphalt plants surrounding your state, who bid on hundreds of millions of dollars in road projects, who want to keep a law in place that says they can give not only unlimited contributions, but unlimited gifts to legislators. They can buy a legislator car in North Dakota. Yeah, I can see the electeds thinking they're moving to North Dakota now. I mean, it's a sweet deal, but that's not illegal. That is not illegal. And so it was to just say this and basically pin on the Koch brothers, say, look, these guys aren't in this for ideology. They're in this to sell asphalt. That's why they want these gifts allowed. So anytime you can question someone ripping you off, that can cut through what otherwise looks like, well, it must just be an ideological argument and a liberal's for this, so I'm against it. You know, you obviously have to get through that wall.
Right. I know that others want to jump in, but I want to turn to Nancy, because at the beginning we said that we would let the audience have a chance to ask some questions. So Nancy agreed to help me and screen some questions. Which can you unmute yourself, Nancy? Nancy, can you unmute yourself?
I just have there was a couple questions, but I'd just like to say there's several pre-law students joining from Hollis University in Roanoke. So I'd like to welcome them. One of the questions, and maybe I'm going to ask it, I'm looking at these other questions, it's the issue of disclosure. I mean, when you think about campaign finance, you're often looking at limitations which are very challenging to legislators. And I know John is well versed in the Ohio corruption case, which is like one of the largest corruption cases probably in modern history. And the question about disclosure, and this goes to perhaps Delegate Van Valkenburg and Senator Deeds, wouldn't there be an appetite for a best practice disclosure law that actually controls like honest ads? I know that limitations are always challenging, but isn't there an appetite for that?
We adopted in Virginia a number of years ago a stand by your ad law that requires on ads to disclose on their face who's paying for them. So tell me how you would differ from that.
Well, I guess now the Campaign Legal Center has because a lot of the ads, and I know Marcus Simon had an honest ads thing, which is just the ads, but now with electioneering and stuff, you're getting a lot of stuff on social media that are paid ads, but they're very hard to monitor. So the question is, would the state be willing to look at a best practices disclosure law that looks at controlling and revealing sources of maybe not dark money, because that's coming from, well, maybe you could even do it for dark money. But
the social media has changed the calculus of politics, because the state doesn't always have a lot of control about what's going to appear on social media or over the internet. I mean, there's a whole different set of rules that apply nationally and internationally to the kind of stuff that can appear on social media. So that sort of reform is really going to have to take place at the federal level, I think.
But is that going to affect state races? I mean, the national federal social media is not affecting your state races. And my question about your stand by the ad, do you have to reveal the root donor, or can you hide behind a PAC? I mean, because in California, you have to go to the root donor.
No, you don't reveal the root donor. You reveal who paid for the ad.
Yeah, but you can have a rule in a state that says, okay, if you got your ad from another group, then they have to say where they got their ad until you get back to the names of the people that actually put up the fundamental money.
I don't really know who does that in Virginia. I mean, in Virginia, there's certainly ads, at least for candidates. And John, I wanted to tell you, my grandfather was on the crew that built out that state park, and both my father and I worked there as teenagers. So
Wow.
I know the park very well. But what I was going to say is that you know, I think with respect to the internet internet service providers, with respect to the what's available on social media, a lot of that's going to have to be governed by federal law. We can certainly impose limitations in the state, and we've done that. But here's the problem. You know, the only ads that I know of that are paid for by other people specifically, if the Democratic Party of Virginia or the Republican Party of Virginia, the Republican Governors Association or the Democratic Governors Association or the Democratic Attorney General's Association or whatever, if they pay for an ad, that has to be advertised. Where the specific contribution that comes from that pays for it, you know, that's going to be more difficult because money is a fungible thing.
Yeah, but
let me break in here, Hedrick. We're up against our time limit, and I hope that we can run over a little bit for those who can stay with us. Stair Calhoun has kindly said that we can run over a little bit, but since we are past 8, I wanted to give all of the panelists a chance for a quick closing comment, and then we can go back and try to answer other questions from the audience if you can stay with us. Senator Deeds, would you like to start off with the closing comment?
Sure, and I'm not going to be able to stay very long because my cat has just gotten sick in front of me here, and I'm either going to have to end up I'm going to sit. The longer I sit and look at this stuff, the closer it's going to be to me getting sick. So I've got to get up and fix that. But I wanted to say that what we have to do is pass the constitutional amendment to give the states the ability to regulate what we spend. And the bottom line, the constitutional amendment has to say that campaign spending is not free speech. It's not speech at all. And so we can develop British-style elections. We can limit the amount that's spent. We can limit the amount of time that's spent campaigning, so ordinary people can be involved in politics. You know, I fear that we exclude too many people from our process, and that's because it's just so expensive to be involved. It's hard to raise the money. It's hard to be involved in campaigns. We have to do a better job, and we have to demand action at the federal level, and that's going to require, I think, a constitutional amendment because of the Buckley case primarily, and also the Citizens United. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your participation and your support, Senator. Delegate Van Valkenburg.
Yeah, I'll first, just real quickly on that previous question, I think on candidate spending, I think we're actually all right. I think the big issue is when people outside groups spend money is where we could really tighten up kind of the disclosure laws. So, I mean, a lot of outside groups don't spend because they can just give the money directly to the candidate. And so then the candidate can do the message. It's actually interesting. I had 2 outside groups spend in my race the last go around, and that's actually kind of infrequent and rare. And so, but I do think that's kind of an area where we can disclose. In terms of a closing remark, you know, I think the senator is right about the need for a constitutional amendment or a Supreme Court that will overrule Buckley in terms of the ultimate goal. You know, I think the one thing I would say is, and I said it before, is I don't think the goal should be to limit money, because I do think we want people to get the message about politics. And I think very often when you're in a society where almost anyone can vote, which is a great thing, it's really hard to communicate with the least educated voter, right? The least informed voter. And we want to try to reach out to them. I think the question is, once again, how you get the money, how you can spend it, right? The processes in place. To the senator's point, we should have much shorter election cycles, right? There should be limitations on when you can spend that money, right? There should be a process in place that accentuates the average person being involved, because when the average person is the person giving the candidate money, it's their voice that's going to be reflected more often. And so I really think the key is, before we get that amendment, how can we best do that in this world that's very limited? with the long-term goal of overturning Buckley so that we can actually have a more robust form of, regulation is not the right word maybe, but just a change in the kind of infrastructure and institutions of how we spend so that money comes from constituents and it goes towards educating those constituents. It's through the candidate, and it's not this divisive, disgusting politics, but it's more educational and it's more, you know, small d democratic. And I can stick around for a little bit.
Great, thank you so much. Nancy, your closing comments? Nancy, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, just my message is please join us. This is my favorite, cartoon, and I was telling Hedrick that sometimes I feel like this in Virginia, but every time I talk to him or when I talk to John, I just feel a little bit more powerful. So anyway, here are Mike and my names, and I just want to say, go back to John Lewis, and why is it important when you see something isn't right or isn't just, we have to speak up because nobody is going to do it for us. So as Lisa Sales is on one of our colleagues with the ERA in Virginia, I think that's a good example of how mobilization, grassroots mobilization led to a constitutional amendment, and we can do this in Virginia, so please join us.
Thank you, Nancy. John Pudner.
Yes, I'm sure a few in the audience maybe were thrown at first, you know, when Delegate Van Valkenburg said, you know, it's not really just get money out of politics, but it's really important to understand why that is important. It's fine to use that as a slogan, but the point of an amendment is it just allows the states to figure out the best solution for their state. Now, in a state like Montana, that might be getting a lot of the money out because outside money is coming and corrupted things. In another state, it might be full transparency where you haven't had it. But the point is, you don't have to win those arguments to pass a constitutional amendment. What you need is to stop Citizens United from preventing you from doing so many things that you'd like to do, and then fit it to the state. What's more Republican for me than a states' rights argument here, that the state knows best what rules fit for its state? Why is this, you know, abhorrent to Republicans now that we talk about, you know, stopping Citizens United? So, you know, we often will say things like stop pay-for-play politics. Again, back to the delegate's point, it's the kind of money that's spent. It's government contractors sneaking it in. You have people, you know, who want things from government, want your tax money. It's a trading of dollars, campaign dollars for taxpayer dollars. So, you know, again, this isn't discouraged at all. People want to campaign and get money out of politics. That's very powerful for many. But I think there are little tweaks that still are very pro amendment. You know, let us have the right to do this. And the last thing on social media, unrelated, but, you know, we won a case against Facebook in the FEC a few years ago. I think we might have been the last one to win a case because they don't have enough commissioners now. But just saying they had to disclose who was doing their ads. Facebook was still arguing that they were different from all other media and should not have to put who's doing paid ads up. I'm not talking someone posting. And we're sitting here going, wait a second, the Russians just did a couple $100,000 in ads we know of, and you still don't think we should be disclosing? And we actually won that. We actually got the FEC commissioners from both sides who, you know, normally we're just at each other's throats to pass it. So that's just one of those breakthrough moments I want to mention, that's why Facebook now has to put ads on, has to put disclosures on their ads. So you can win some of these battles short of an amendment, but in the end, yes, the amendment's the big thing. You've got to get there to have real change.
Thank you, John. Thanks for joining us. Can you hang around a little bit longer?
I'm good, thanks.
Thank you. Hedrick, you let us off this evening. We're going to give you the final word before we go into the extra session.
You just heard something really important. You just heard Craig Deeds, Democrat, John Pudner, Republican, agreeing that you need an amendment from various different viewpoints, and you know, saying maybe it's disclosure in one state, maybe it's limits in another, maybe it's public funding. I think that if you are a citizen, not a politician, not somebody in office now, and we got, you know, 3 of our panelists here are either politicians or have been spending a lot of time in politics as professionals. If you're an ordinary citizen, and over the last decade, or even over the last year or two, you've become upset at some aspect of too much money in politics or too much dark money in politics, then you need to take action. And I think the great thing that you're hearing is that people in Washington State and people in North Dakota and people in Connecticut and people in Florida and people in all kinds of other states have been doing this. It's out there. What I said at the beginning pertains. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, but powerlessness also corrupts. And so if we want our democracy, we have to exercise it. It's not a spectator sport. It's a participant sport. We've all got to get on the team. We got to get out on the field. And the great thing is, if we do, it can make a difference. And Virginia is in a really fortunate place because it's had a shift in the legislature. As the delegate was saying a little while ago, you know, it used to be the Democrats who were in favor of gerrymander reform, and then it was the Republicans, and it shifted back and forth because political control is going back and forth. But at the grassroots, it's everybody wants a fair playing field. So we want it, we got to do something about it. And the great thing is you're doing something.
Great. Thank you for those inspiring words, Cedric. And thank you for your video. I hope everyone can take the time to watch the Democracy Rebellion. It really is inspiring. It gives one hope. Nancy, can you help us out? Were there any other questions
Sure,
from the audience?
It was a question from Ishwari, who is my American Promise leader in New Mexico. And I think it's her question. You addressed it a little bit in your last answer, but the entry point for engagement with conservatives, if, you know, knowing Virginia, how does, all of our group is sort of in Northern Virginia, how do we make entry points with conservatives, and how do we get a bipartisan bill? And then, of course, looking at Congress and the HJR2 and stuff like that, what do you see the prospects in actually getting a bipartisan bill in the House and the Senate?
Sure. Well, of course, there's a chance in November you won't need a bipartisan bill in the House and Senate at the federal level, but I'm hoping it isn't that bad, but we'll see. But yeah, in the state, yeah, I just think the Republican terms, that pay for play I mentioned, yeah, look, there are people, and special interest is a very safe word to use. Yeah, pay for play special interests who want to buy your tax dollars with their political contributions. I think the more that language can be used downstate, out of Northern Virginia, the more you can resonate. And to the point, and I did read the full question there. Yeah, most Republicans would like to see Citizens United ended. And I would tell you that quietly, a lot of the electeds, even in DC, would like it ended because they don't like spending 4 to 6 hours on the phone a day asking for money. And again, back to Delegate Valkenburg's point, you know, the limit really is bad. It is 2,800. It's gone up 1, but you know, you're basically can be threatened by someone with an LLC or super PAC. They're going to run $10 million in ads of you, and then you're sitting here raising $2,800 at a time. Quietly, even electeds don't like that. They're scared of leadership who's controlling the monies. That's your little catch-22 here, you know, not getting, you know, speaking out on it. But there's really a groundswell of support there for just how miserable a life it is to be a member of Congress right now, just because all you're doing is fundraising. And so I think there's some real openings there. And that was the first issue I had walking around the halls up there with the Republicans. Oh, I'm really with you. There's some way we can get to that. So, yeah, there's some hope there, but starts with the grassroots, build it up. And sometimes it's just terminology. Just don't make the easy mistake, the red flag word that, you know, makes someone think, you know, oh, well, they're just anti-business and I'm pro-business. You know, it's just usually a word or two that might change your pitch to a Republican.
John, do you have chapters all over the country in every state, including Virginia?
We do. Rhode Island's a little weak. I just got to be honest. We were once again racking our brains. So if anyone here has Rhode Island contacts, but no, we've got some good people. More down in Richmond, and they have helped us organize get-togethers for the Bird Theater and places. So yeah, we've certainly looked involved.
If I can jump in here too, I think one thing that's helpful is we often think about this issue in isolation, right? And I think it's helpful actually to talk about something like redistricting, because when you think about how many seats in the General Assembly, you know, there's 140 seats in the General Assembly, and when you think about how many of them are competitive, this is a guess, but let's say it's 15 to 20 are competitive. And so you have 15 to 20 legislators, myself being one of them, who full-time have to think about how I'm going to win, right? So I can think about policy like I'm doing right now, and I can think about the legislation I'm going to carry. But in the back of my mind, or in the front of my mind, I always have to be thinking about how I'm going to win, because in another, 2 months, I'm on the clock. And the incentives that I have versus the incentives that a safe seat has is just so fundamentally different, right? So if you're a safe seat senator or delegate, the easiest money in the world is just calling up interest group money, lobbyist money, or some of the big ideological donor money, because they're going to give to you because they know you're going to be back. And you don't have to do that grassroots fundraising because you're not really in danger. And if somebody comes at you, you've got more money than them just from that money. Whereas somebody like me, my race last year was 2.5 million, I think. And, I didn't raise all of that, and my opponent didn't raise all of hers, right? She had an ample amount of dark money, and I had some money come from outside groups too. But when you think about like how I have to raise money versus they do, redistricting reform helps make the argument for campaign finance reform. Because the more legislators who are in places like mine, where you're like, oh my God, do I really, I just taught a whole day. Do I have to do 3 hours on the phone raising money? And my campaign manager is like, yeah, if you want to get reelected, you do. And so, I'm burning it at both ends in the spring of the school year. The more people who are in positions like mine, the more you're going to find legislators who are like, yes, can we please end this miserable system? And so I think there's a world in which all these good government issues play off of each other, right? And let's be real, right? They're all popular for the reason that many people have noted: fairness, right? Feeling like you have a say and a voice. And so I think it's important to realize that these reforms build on each other. And so I think that you'll see, if this amendment passes, which I hope it does, and disclaimer, I carried it on the House side. I think when you see more competitive districts and more of a potential sway in both houses, I think you'll see more kind of, hey, let's do this. Let's talk about some reform.
And if I could throw in one plug for the good delegate here, please don't beat up your local state delegate or state senator and tell them never accept any outside money. I know that sounds good. But if they're sponsoring the right legislation, they do have to play by the rules of the game. I got burned early to take back our republic because one of the Florida congressmen, who was all with us on everything, then publicly announced he would not ask anyone for money that year. Well, he gets trounced and loses his seat. Now, what does that do for the movement? So I know sometimes you feel like just saying, hey, you shouldn't be getting any money either. No, if someone's trying to pass a law, they've got to win by the rules that are in place, unfortunately. So, that may be an unpopular statement, but please don't beat up a good reformer because they got some money from out of state or something. I'm not talking corrupt money, but just the normal stuff. They've got to get it to win. They're going to lose. And that one Florida example really was a setback within the Republican caucus.
Well, let me thank each of you again. This has been a great discussion. Appreciate your staying on a little extra time. Stair, thank you for letting us go over a little bit. I do want to thank again all of our co-sponsors, in addition to American Promise, Network Nova, Clean Money Squad, Williamsburg, JCC Invisible, Clean Virginia, Voters' Rights to Know, Activate Virginia, and Uncoke My Campus. And to all of the panelists tonight, thanks a million. This has been a great discussion. Delegate Van Valkenburg, I think you got plenty of material for your high school class on the Constitution.
Indeed.
Appreciate your participation.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Nice seeing you, John, again. We will be talking about a Virginia strategy here. So thank you to Delegate Van Valkenburg, and bye, everybody.
Thank you, Nancy.
Take it easy.
Organize this.
Thank you, Nancy.